If you like true crime, dark history, the haunted and paranormal, then we think you'll like Ghost Town.
Ghost Town is hosted by me, Rebecca Lieb.
And me, Jason Horton.
We cover both notorious and obscure true crimes,
the haunted, paranormal, and unexplained,
and the dark history of everything from world events to pop culture.
There are new episodes of Ghost Town every Wednesday and Friday.
Find out for yourself what Vulture.com called essential listening and one listener called a total waste of time.
So pause the podcast you're listening to right now.
And go subscribe to Ghost Town for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And at ghosttownpod.com.
Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I'm your host, Rebecca Sebastian, and I am thrilled to be back with you today for another new episode. I hope you're in the mood for another mob conversation because that's what today is. But of course, it gets far deeper into the conversation of right and wrong, justice and injustice. And my guest today, we get into a really great conversation. Jake Halpern is on today. He's the host of the new, very new, just dropped this week actually, investigative podcast produced by Pushkin Industries called Mobland. Now, Mobland is season 2 of Deep Cover. And this season, it centers around a man named Bob Cooley, who was a lawyer and fixer for the mafia. So he took care of things, if you know what I'm saying, for the mob. Take a listen.
As far as I'm concerned, I'm a dead man right now.
This is Bob Cooley. Or I should say, this was Bob Cooley.
When I say I'm dead, maybe not even physically dead, but I'm dead in terms of Robert Cooley no longer exists.
It all started back in the 1970s when Bob was a lawyer in Chicago. A powerful mobster asked Bob to fix a case, a murder case, so a hitman could get off scot-free.
If you say you can do it and you can't, that could be a problem. I know what that means. It means you get an extra hole in your head.
It turns out Bob was really good at fixing cases, and he did it for years until one day he decided to switch sides, go over to the FBI, and betray the mob.
The moment I put the wire on the first time, my life was over. I could never practice law anymore. I could never stay in the city anymore.
Bob could give us judges, lawyers, police officers, politicians. He could wire up against those people and go be Bob Cooley.
I would come into the office in the morning, and if he didn't call me right away, I didn't know if he was in a trunk somewhere, dead.
If it ever got out, they would kill me in a heartbeat.
For approximately 5 years, a Chicago lawyer has been a government informant, secretly recording conversations with some of this city's movers and shakers.
If you're wondering, why would a guy like Bob Cooley just decide to flip? Well, you're not alone. I've wondered the same thing myself, and I've talked to FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and former mobsters. Many of them are still wondering, who was Bob Cooley, really?
I wouldn't trust that guy. He looks like a little scumbag liar, stool pigeon. He looked like what he was, a rat. Like, is this guy for real?
From my perspective, Bob was too good to be true. There's got to be something wrong with this.
I can say with all certainty, I think he's a hero because he didn't have to do what he did, and he did it anyway.
Is he a plant? Is he a double agent? What is he?
I'm Jake Halpern, and this is Deep Cover Season 2, Mobland, coming January 24th from Pushkin Industries.
Pleasure man on the run. Should've left when it was fun. Pleasure man on the run. Should've left when it was fun.
Subscribe to Pushkin Plus, and you can binge the whole season ads-free. Find Pushkin Plus on the Deep Cover show page in Apple Podcasts or at pushkin.fm/plus.
So Jake and I talk about whether or not we trust Bob and what his motives might be and what is justice really in this case. Jake Halpern is a seasoned storyteller, and you will hear that in his thoughtful, story-driven answers in our interview today. Jake's work has been featured on Planet Money, All Things Considered, This American Life, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for his New York Times series, Welcome to the New World, which was a graphic narrative and now is a book, which tells the story of a refugee family from Syria. It was honestly just an honor to meet and speak with him. And I know Jake has done a lot of interviews over the course of his career, but I'm sure this is the first one where a Housewives mafia analogy has been made. So I don't know, maybe this will be my legacy. I hope you enjoy this conversation. As always, please drop me a note. The link to my contact page and my email are in the show notes, as will be a link to listen to this fantastic podcast. You can also follow me on social media across all platforms. I am at Dialogue Pod. That's DIE-ALOGUE-POD. With that, enjoy the episode with Jake Halpern. And Jake, thank you for killing the small talk. Jake, welcome to Dialogue Podcast. I'm very excited to talk to you today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Well, gosh, there's a lot of places we could start, and I really want to get into your new podcast, but I have this opportunity to talk to you, and you're such a prolific writer. You've done everything from graphic nonfiction essays to novels and now podcasts. So what's that journey as a writer been like?
Well, it's been a learning curve. I think that I do believe that storytelling is storytelling at some core level. My litmus test is we were talking a second ago before we started about kids. And I remember we were living in India and my boys were 5 and 3. And I was writing this really lengthy story for the New Yorker about a temple where they'd found all this treasure in the basement. And we drove past the temple and my 5-year-old said something like, "Dad, isn't that's the temple you're writing about?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "What's the story, Dad?" And I was like, it was funny because I was writing it at the time. I was like, "That's really complicated, son." He said, "Yeah. What's the story?" And I thought like, okay. And I tried to then explain to a 5-year-old what this New Yorker story was. And as I was about 30 seconds into it, I realized that I was telling it totally wrong for the New Yorker, because I have this belief that any story, no matter how complicated, you should be able to tell to a 5 or 6-year-old. And if they don't understand it, then it's either not a story or you're not telling it correctly.
Brilliant.
And so to me, that is like the maxim that to some extent, it doesn't matter whether it's a graphic narrative or a novel or a podcast. I should be able to tell you relatively succinctly what it is. And so that's the thing I fall back on. I think like, well, even though the medium has changed, maybe I can do this. And then specifically with podcasts, I had the opportunity to do work with This American Life over the years, and they were pretty much doing this before it was called a podcast, This kind of narrative audio telling. Mm-hmm. And so I did have some sense of that. And I had a chance to work with Sarah Koenig, who of course did Serial. She worked on this story of mine called Switched at Birth. And so I had these like moments where I kind of saw how the sausage was made, but they were more just like parachute in for a story and then out. This was much different. This was serialized story. It told over 10 episodes. And so there was a lot of learning that had to take place there.
Wait, got it. So then specifically this story, so Deep Cover is kind of this umbrella of show. And season 1 was about the drug wars.
Yep.
And then season 2 is called Deep Cover, which comes out January 24th. So actually it is out in Magic Podcast Time Machine Land.
Yes. Passing forward.
Right. That's out now. So talk to us about what that story is. Maybe set the scene a little bit. We're in like 1970s Chicago, mafia.
Yeah. Yep. So we're in 1970s Chicago. And this is a place where the mob, or the outfit as it's known in Chicago, still operates with relative impunity. If you think back to like the most famous gangster that we all know, Al Capone, he was a Chicago-based gangster. You know, you've probably seen the movies where it comes to power during the Prohibition era. But even 50 odd years later in the 70s, the mob controls much of the city. And the court systems are deeply corrupt. And the mob has found a way to use this corruption systematically so that it is able to protect its own people, and its hitmen and its bookies and everyone else can do whatever they please and face basically no consequences. And it's really important to understand that is what the mob offers its members. So if you think about the mob as like a corporation or something, or a franchise, and you have all these people that are participating, what the mob can offer you is, hey, you stick with us. You're not going to go to jail. You're not going to get in trouble. We're going to take care of you because we own the courts. But if for some way you could break that corruption, then you would deprive the mob of the principal benefit that it offers all of its members. So it's not just like the corruption and the mob are kind of two random things. The corruption was integral to the mob's power and its value to its members.
So in the way you're describing it, would you say that the corruption predates the mafia and they leverage and utilize it to their advantage? Or do you think they put that upon our system?
That's a really great question. It's a kind of like which came first,
exactly,
kind of thing, right? Is the corruption the result of the mob, or is the mob just kind of capitalizing on something that exists? And I think that the two are so deeply interconnected. So I think that probably if you're thinking about because corruption probably goes back to the dawn of man. Like sure. there's someone that has power, or there's a judge, or there's someone else that wants to kind of get an advantage. And so they're slipping gold coins under the table. Like that's probably there from the very beginning of organized government, right? But I think what the mob does and what organized crime does is it looks at that and says, hey, we can use that and implement that to our advantage as a whole system. We can have a guy who's basically our government liaison. In this case, it's this guy, Pat Marcy, who is in charge of all this and has a kind of system to it. So we're not kind of reinventing the wheel every time we're figuring it out. It's like, oh, we need to fix this. We go to this guy, we use that guy. It's a whole system in place. So I think the mob recognizes the corruption is going on, but what they do is they just create a whole scheme that utilizes it to their advantage very efficiently. And so that's probably how I would answer that question.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I love the mob to corporation analogy. I've been thinking a lot about cults as businesses and how they have to have sort of a structure and a hierarchy. So can you introduce us to the primary figure in the show in Mobland that we meet, Bob Cooley?
Right. So
sort of.
Yeah, exactly. So if you think about it, Chicago, 1970s, and then into the 80s, there's this world where the mob operates with relative impunity. And the FBI tries to infiltrate it, but never successfully, because even when they have a case with a witness, the witness gets killed right before trial, or a case gets fixed, and they can never really make the headway they want. And they don't have top-level people that are kind of defecting. And then one day, out of the blue, in 1986, this man named Robert Cooley walks into the office of a federal prosecutor named Gary Shapiro and claims to be a lawyer for the mob, not just a lawyer for the mob, but a fixer, a guy who has been basically at the center, at the dark center of corrupting cases for a very long time. In fact, he tells them the famous Harry Alaman case where the hitman killed the Teamster and got off, and everyone, that was fixed. And I know it was fixed because I'm the guy who did it. And so he doesn't tell this all to Gary in the first meeting, but he starts intimating that he knows how this works and that he was a part of it, and hinting that he can deliver the mob. But the prosecutors are deeply skeptical. Gary says something like, I was convinced that he had a messiah complex, and yet, who am I to say no to the Messiah on the chance that he's true? And so it's like he seems too good to be true. And so there's this cat and mouse kind of thing where they don't trust him. He obviously doesn't trust them because he doesn't want to get killed. And so there's a period of time in which they're trying to figure out whether this guy's for real. Is he a mob mole? And then eventually they do become convinced that this guy is who he says he is. And maybe if used well, can do what he says he can do, which is, take down the mob, particularly its governmental kind of corruption aspect.
So he goes from lawyer to fixer to informant. How rare is that? I mean, I can't imagine this happens a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I asked this question to Steve Bowen, who is the FBI handler. I said, how often did this happen? And he laughed. He said, are you kidding me? Never. This never happens, which was part of why they were so doubtful that it was true.
Right.
And I would say that he's not just an informant. He is offering. He is an informant in the sense that he's offering information. But eventually what he offers to do is beyond that. He says, I will wear a wire, wire me up, and I will walk into the inner sanctum of where these guys operate, and I will get them on tape. I will incriminate them on tape. And that's a whole nother level of rare, because you're taking your life in your hands when you do that. And that brings this whole next round of questioning, which is to say, do we have reason to believe that he'll be good at doing that, or is he just going to get killed? Right. And so that's kind of where we go from there. Yeah.
And the other line of questioning I get into is, what's the motive there? So I have to imagine it's a redemptive change of heart, or he's backed up against a wall for some reason and is this is like his only way out. What do you think is motivating his decision-making?
That's a really, I guess I would say, very important, even profound question at the center of this, and it's directly related to, do we trust him, right? Because it's the first question the FBI asks. They say, because motive will totally define whether they find him credible, whether they can count on him. And so the first thing they do, and it's interesting because when Bob walks in, right, one of the first thing he says, I want you to check whether there's any ongoing investigations into who I am. And he claims that he wants them to do this because when this all comes out in the wash, he doesn't want anyone to say that he was a rat who walked in there to save his own skin, which is also kind of an odd thing to say. Like, you're already thinking about your legacy and you just walked in. So they run the kind of, the background look on him, and there's nothing on him. No one has any dirt on him. So that's not it. He's not obviously in danger. The mob's not going to kill him. He has some gambling debts, but they're not. But he's gambled his whole life, and the debts are no much bigger than he's ever up or down. Mm-hmm. The debts don't seem to explain. Plus, he's offering to stick around. He ends up wearing the wire for 3 years. So it's not like if you had like that many debts and you were trying to get out of your debts, you would just become an informant and you would vanish.
Yeah.
But he's sticking. So that doesn't quite explain it. So, and we're kind of constantly scratching our heads. He's got this other story that his dad on his deathbed pulls him aside and says, straighten out your life. And it's you're kind of buying into it, but you're also like, is that really the reason? And so me as the journalist, you as the listener, the FBI back in the 70s and 80s as the investigators, they're all grappling with this question, because the implications of the question are profound. Because is he an opportunist? Right. Is he a moralist who's making a redemption? Depending on how that question pans out, it colors everything that he brings in a different way.
Did you land anywhere definitively for your own point of view?
I do. I build, and I don't want to give too much of a spoiler away, but we do build to it in the end about what we think. I set out the question front and center at the beginning, and it was funny. Towards the very end of the process, my editor, Karen Shakurji, she basically said, Jake, you gotta this can't be one of those podcasts where you ask the question and then you forget you asked it. And so we do go back deep into it at the end when we're talking about who Bob is and what his legacy is.
Okay, good.
Part of it is, I will give you a hint. Part of it is straight up, it involves power. which is the mob. And he was, by flipping, he gets great power because then he's the one that is threatening the mob instead of the other way around. So power is a big part of it.
Yeah, it's like breaking up when you know you're going to get broken up, being the first to break up. It's like, but it's a power move. And he sounds very strategic. If he was having them do that recon before he committed, I mean, he's thinking 2 steps ahead. He's obviously a very, savvy person.
He is very savvy. And in fact, I mean, I interviewed Bob over the course of a year, and there were times where we would be interviewing him and he would say to me, Jake, it's like you're cross-examining me. But it was because Bob was so adept at kind of giving very good answers to everything I said, but also answers that maybe shade the story in the way that he wants it shaded. And he's a very fast-talking, smart lawyer. And so you can't just ask him a question once and take it as gospel. I told him, I said, Bob, I have to do my job here. I'm sorry, but I got to push back on this. And there was a lot of that. And we got to know each other very well over the year of these calls.
Did your impression of him change from the first time you spoke with him to the end of your time together? What was that arc like?
Yeah, it did. I think I was very, look, as a journalist, you always have to, on some level, think that everyone's lying to you about everything. Otherwise, you get had. And I think that, so I kind of came to have a better sense of where I really thought his story, there's things that became clear to me. Let's put it that way. One of which was, say whatever you want about Bob Cooley, about any of the many questionable things he did, including fixing murder trials. And we can get into that. When he flips and wears that wire, whether you see that as a move that makes him a rat or a hero, it is a move that required tremendous courage. And we got a hold of these audio of the secret tape recordings of him operating when he was undercover. And I was amazed at how he was even just joking around and kind of had this, he was just beyond cavalier, even when, and so on some level, there was a kind of respect for him and what he had done. On the other hand, I talked to the people involved. I talked to the niece of the murder victim in the case he fixed. I talked to the police officer who was brutally assaulted, a female police officer was brutally assaulted in another case that he was involved that was fixed. And you start to understand that it's almost like you hear this phrase "fixing cases," but you forget that there are personal narratives that are profound, and that, like, this family, the one family where there was the murder that he fixed, they knew that something had gone on, and that injustice like festered like a wound in that family for 20 years, and there was no peace because of it. And I think so in that way it was hard, because I really came to feel kind of emotionally what the consequences of these actions that he had done were. So it was really complicated. Yeah.
So it ends up being one of those things that I think come up here all the time, that there's basically no black or white answer. There's that messy gray middle where 2 things can be true at once, like him being brave and courageous to do that. Also amazing that he was that comfortable in that scenario. Like, that says a lot about who we're talking about. But I'm really glad you brought up the more unseen parts of these stories, where there's the entertainment, almost glamorized, like perception of mob cases. And it's like bada bing, bada boom, like got that case thrown out and this and that. But the reality of like what happened to the people involved. I mean, if it was you or your family and you have this injustice happen and you either know or you don't, why it went that way is just awful to think about. And there is a murder and a story at the center of this story where there's 2 trials for a hitman, right? And
Right.
Bob was the fixer on that one. And that story it's almost like a tragedy upon tragedy, because can you talk about that? I think it happens in episode 2 or 3.
Yeah. So this story it's really powerful, and it's kind of how Bob gets his start. So just to give you a sense of how Bob got into being a fixer, he shows up in court the first day and he wins a DUI case, and the judge's bagman approaches him in the hallway and says, the first one was on us, now you got to pay. So it's almost like a gateway drug. He's in traffic court and everyone's and it just moves on up. Then he's working gambling and gun court, and it's still bribe based, and he's partaking in it like a lot of other people. This is not to give him a pass, but there was at all. In fact, he has a brother who was totally squeaky clean lawyer. So, and they shared an office, they shared a desk. So that was really interesting. But anyway, Bob's big break comes when one of the mob's, what I call the political czar, the guy at the mob who's responsible for basically government corruption, has heard of Bob, heard of his reputation, and they need someone to help them because the guy that's reputed to be their top hitman, Harry Elamon, is on trial for a murder, and there's 2 eyewitnesses pegging him at the murder. And he asks Bob if he'll handle the case. And so Bob looks into it and feels, now it's interesting, when asked to do this, Bob is not looking to whether this guy's innocent or not. He says straight up to me, I knew this guy was guilty. What he looks at is if there's enough doubt that exists based on the evidence that the judge has enough to what they call hang his hat on. In other words, the judge can issue a not guilty verdict and it won't look like a bribe occurred, because his whole thing is, if I ask the judge to take the bribe, I want the judge to basically have cover.
Yeah.
So he finds this judge who has a very honorable reputation, a guy named Frank Wilson. And as far as we can tell, and everyone can tell, there's no other bribe that ever passes this judge's hands. And somehow or another, as Bob tells it, and as we explore, he convinces this judge in this one case to take the bribe. And so what happens is that as it goes to trial, the family of the victim that the guy, the hitman, killed, they're worried that exactly this may happen. The niece of the victim says to me, we were all saying, hey, this is Chicago. We're not sure justice is going to occur. But they've got this witness, and the witness kind of amazingly under pressure says, I'm going to do the right thing. He's the neighbor. I'm going to go in there and I'm going to say what I saw. And I say it almost becomes like a parable of community, because he's risking his own neck so that his neighbor can get a shot at justice, and he's not intimidated. And the case goes on, and as the verdict gets ready to come out, Bob actually gets in his car and starts driving west out of Chicago, thinking if the judge changes his mind, Bob better not be in town because it's Bob on the hook. And he's listening to the radio, and crackling over the radio, he hears the verdict, and he turns his car back around. The verdict is not guilty. Yeah. And he turns his car back around, and he comes back into Chicago, and he can see the skyline, and he knows he's the man. He's fixed this kind of unfixable case. But so that all sounds like very glamorous from a kind of mob perspective. But the reality is, for the victim of this guy, Billy Logan, that the reputed hitman killed, they're devastated because their uncle and brother was murdered. It looked like there was going to be justice, and the carpet was pulled out from underneath them. And the family just doesn't quite recover. The aunt becomes obsessed with the story, the brother's sister, and for 20 years. And then, without telling you the whole story, when Bob flips and starts working with the FBI, he becomes determined that he's going to kind of right this wrong and is going to expose what he did and what Pat Marcy asked him to do. And the trick is that the hitman is protected at this point, not by the mob, but by the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which says you can't be placed in double jeopardy and tried again. And that sets the stage for this retrial. The case goes up to the Supreme Court, and it's pretty wild.
Would he have any culpability in that? I mean, he does, but is he facing anything or not because of his protection now because of his cooperation?
This is a great question, right? Because when Bob, so what happens is the appeal, the question of double jeopardy, right? Can this hitman be tried a second time? And his lawyer says no. Mm-hmm. And the case goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically rules, look, because it appears that there's been a bribe here, he was never in jeopardy in the first place. Therefore, the retrial 20 years later may go forward, and this hitman may be tried. Now, what happens at the retrial? Bob Cooley takes the stand and says to the jury, hey, folks, I fixed this case. And this is important for you all to know, because this is the kind of person that this defendant is, and this is why we're having the retrial. And so it's evidence that in theory helps get this conviction. But you're totally right to say he's not a passive witness. He's an active participant,
right, in
having fixed this case in the first place, letting a guy walk free who then may go on to kill other people. This is, and he doesn't face prosecution for this. And this is, there's never, as far as I can tell, explicitly like an agreement with a quid pro quo with the government. But I think that's the reality, which is, you're helping us, we're not going to come after you. Bob would say they never had the goods on me until I started talking, and et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, it's complicated with Bob. He cannot be categorized easily on the kind of scale of right and wrong.
Which is why he's a compelling podcast figure, right? I mean, people are going to be on this journey with you, listening every week and making up their opinions about him. But I'm just trying to imagine that moment. If you know this judge actually, if you know him not to be somebody who's been bribed before, the boldness it takes to ask, to go for it. I mean, I think it really speaks to the power you must feel behind you when you're working with the mafia.
Yeah.
And I hope this question comes off okay, but is it safe to assume when we're talking about legal representation of mob members, the 70s, 80s, 90s, and we've obviously have a lot of it in New York City. Is it safe to assume those cases are all fixed in some capacity? Is there any honest lawyer representing them and just, because it's the right of every citizen in our country to have good representation or any kind of representation?
I mean,
should I edit this? We'll talk. You answer, and then I'll just.
You often hear criminal defense lawyers say, "I don't know if I had a paying client that was innocent." I mean, I think that I'm not an expert in this field, but I think that is definitely the conventional wisdom with these guys.
So in 2020, where we sit now, do you think we're still as vulnerable in court to these kinds of fixes and bribes playing out and affecting outcomes?
I think there's no question that it's much better than it was, especially in a place like Chicago. I mean, in a place like Chicago, it's really hard to grasp just how ubiquitous the corruption was. It was just, if you had money, you didn't have to have the indignity of going to trial where you risked being guilty. I mean, that's fundamentally changed. Is Chicago still have corruption? Absolutely. But I think it's far less corrupt than it was. And at least in Chicago, Bob Cooley deserves some credit for that. I mean, I think that's what's so fascinating about this tale is that the listener may come away feeling like, gosh, this guy did an awful lot of questionable and bad things. So what is that? Does that erase those things or make good for that? If he's done something that resulted in a great deal of good, and then you can start arguing about what was his motivation to do the good? Was it in fact a desire to do something moral? Was it a power move against the mob? Does that change? I mean, all this is super fascinating to me.
It is. But what about the timing of it? Why now? Why is he telling the story with you? And kind of how did that all come to be in this moment?
Yeah. So kind of random. So the first season of Deep Cover was a totally different story. It told the story of this FBI agent who infiltrated a drug smuggling ring and was also undercover for about 5 years and worked his way up to the top. And I had never really told it was also an 80s based story. I had never told a kind of historical story. So the challenge with a story that old is that people's memories are old and some of the actors are dead, you know. The benefit is that people were ready to talk because most of the people involved were getting on in years, were maybe approaching kind of, you know, their retirement or even the end of their life. And they felt that like, well, I want to say what I want to say while I'm still alive. And I think that that was the case with Bob. He just wanted to talk. And he was, you know, I got him at a moment when he wanted to talk. And so in our conversations, he's obviously trying to protect his legacy, which is his right. And then my job is to kind of push back against that. There's one point in the 9th episode of the podcast that is really emotional. And he's talking when he flips and starts telling the secrets that he knows, there are some profound consequences and some people's lives are really upended. And we start talking about this. And as we started talking about it, Bob quite understandably got really emotional. And he broke down at one point. And I said to him, have you ever talked about this with anyone? He said, like who, Jake? And I said, I don't know. Girlfriend? No. Therapist? No. Friend? No. He just said, I just bottled it up. That's what I did. And that made sense to me because I think that it's that bottling up that in the end makes you want to start talking. Because even though he resisted kind of going there into that place, I think he actually really wanted to go there. And in fact, we had a very frank conversation afterwards where I think he felt a little sheepish about the fact that he'd gotten emotional. And I said, Bob, I actually think it's so important because it reveals it's such a human moment where you see, I think the listener will have pathos for you because we understand that everything that you've done, you didn't just do glibly, but that you're processing and that you're trying to you're wrestling with.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can have that conversation the day or the week or even the year right after all of this happens. I think that conversation happens much later on when you're trying to start to think about what does my life mean? Has the good outweighed the bad? Am I a good person? Did I do right by my friends? All of those kind of profound existential questions. And that's why I think that the timing was so crucial for this, that he was ready to tell his story.
Yeah, no, there's a healthy distance now away from it. It's not a gaping open wound, you know, it's kind of scabbing. There's a willingness to confront things that some people are just unable to when they're that close to it. So that actually totally makes sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wasn't sure we were going to get there with Bob. I talked to Bob for a year. And then eventually I went and visited him in person. I think changed things when I went and saw him.
You seem to know him really well. And in the show, you get to know him. He's hard to pin down. If you were to cast him in like the dramatized version of this, does anyone strike you like who might play Bob Cooley?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Because he's such a character.
I think that the actor that could play him is someone that matches the complexity of this guy, which would have to be someone that could give a performance of someone that you both at times despise for what they did and other times admire. I mean, this might be the one easy answer. I feel like a DiCaprio obviously could do a job there. I feel like a Daniel Day-Lewis could do a good job. I mean, I think you just need someone that has a kind of seriousness about them, because here's the problem with this genre, which you alluded to, and I think you're totally right, which is just that it's fetishized.
Yes.
You know, it's like Capone and the gangsters and the wise guys and the
Sopranos.
And it's almost like a cartoon, you know?
Yeah.
And so that was actually an apprehension I had about even getting into this genre. So I think you would need an actor who could very much push past all of that and kind of get into the kind of riddle of who this guy is.
Agreed. And since you brought up the genre, I'd like to explore that a little bit and what you think is behind our obsession with mafia culture in TV and film and books, to the point where I think we are desensitized to the real violence and traumatic way of living that their operations kind of induce upon everybody in their wake.
Yeah.
What do you think what's that all about?
I mean, so one aspect of it, I think, is wish fulfillment. Like, and you've heard people talk about that with Tony Soprano, but I'll just give you like a very small story about this. Just last night, my 15-year-old son and me and our golden retriever, 100-pound golden retriever, walked to the store to buy some ice cream, right? And we're walking down the street and we cross over, and this kid, probably in his late teens, in a pickup truck, just barrels down the street, like looks like he's going 100 miles an hour. And this kid's going to kill someone. And the worst part about it is I've seen this kid in this pickup truck do this multiple times. Okay. And you're watching it and you're thinking, I had a moment of kind of rage it's weird because I'm like a pretty easygoing dad with my golden retriever, but I'm here with my son, and this kid could run over my kid. And there was part of me that wanted to be able to walk up to that car and I could get in the kid's face, and I probably will. I don't know how much it'll mean for Jake, the writer. What I wanted to do is I wanted to be the mobster guy that said, if I ever see you doing that again, you will regret it for the rest of your life. Something like that, right?
Not a threat. It's a promise.
It's a promise, right? And it's weird. Like, it was almost weird to feel that it was just like that's what I want.
That exists in here. Like
that, and it's dark and it's real.
Yeah.
And I think that exists in all of us, and all of us at times want to be able to tell that kid, and not even tell them angrily, tell them calmly. Mm-hmm. If you ever drive down my street like that again, there will be trouble. And to say it calmly and to know you're damn well sure that kid's never going to drive down your street.
Yes.
That's so real and such a deep part of like the human psyche. And I think that the mob channels into that, because with the mob, the whole mob mythology, there is a kind of code to it, right? Like there's a kind of weird chivalry to at least the way that it's sometimes presented.
Yeah, rules, yeah.
Right? And you don't kill family members.
Right.
And you don't mess with people that didn't borrow money from you. So I think that there's a sense of frustration that people sometimes feel that I know I can't call the police and have them deal with this situation.
Right.
And you don't even necessarily want to be the narc that calls the cops.
Right.
So I think this idea that there's this class of people out there that somehow have this code that people are frightened of, and that like kind of occasionally like put the bully in their place or whatever, that's super attractive. And so I think that then you add on all the Hollywood bullshit, basically. And then it's just like beyond irresistible.
Oh man. Yeah. No, that is such a satisfying answer that I had not previously considered or heard from anybody. And I think it really speaks on a human level. And I don't want to genderize this conversation, though I think mafia interest skews a bit male. What you're talking about also, I think women find an outlet for in, I can't believe I'm going to say this, housewives shows. I'm not even kidding. Like, women threaten and speak like that on those shows. And in no other scenario in my life have I ever seen adults behave that way in their friendships and with colleagues.
If you ever come after me or my family ever again, you are going to lose a lot more than just my friendship. This will cost a lot. And I'm not saying this as a threat. I'm saying it as a promise.
So there is it's like an outlet for that thing inside all of us. And like, we all just find a place where it's being expressed that we can escape into. I enjoy that. I'm going to be thinking about that for a while.
Yeah.
Well, I'll close out with this. I mean, all of this is tangentially, at least, related to justice. And I'm learning that you can ask that question, what is justice, to different people and get very different answers. So I'd love to hear from your life experience, your professional experience from working on this story with Bob Cooley. How do you define justice?
Well, being a storyteller, I'm gonna tell you a little story as a way of kind of thinking about this. So I was thinking about corruption a lot, and how insidious corruption is to our sense of justice, because it not only undermines a particular case where someone gets free, but it shakes everyone's faith that they can even get a shot at justice. So anyway, I was looking into one of the cases when Bob was working undercover. He found a case of a young African-American woman who was a model who appears to have been murdered by her husband. And the case, we don't know for sure, looks though like it was probably fixed. Oh. And so I was talking to the murder victim's sister. I interviewed two sisters, and I really got to do something with this story because I couldn't fit it into the podcast. But I said to this woman, the sister, I said, when it became increasingly clear that this case was likely fixed, what was your reaction? Were you, thinking she was going to say, I was shocked or was outraged? Mm-hmm. And she said to me, well, Jake, as a Black woman in Chicago, I don't think I walked into that situation expecting necessarily justice in the first place. And so I think that the way that we think about justice has got to be predefined by who we are in the first place, of what our expectation is. And so my expectation of justice is totally different than someone else's. And so I think that the only way that justice in some kind of pure, empirical form can be achieved is when everyone more or less can have the same expectation of it being realized. So it's a bit of a roundabout way of answering it, but it was just a moment that made me think about there's many forms of entitlement, and perhaps one of the most saddest and most tragic forms of entitlement is the kind of entitlement that I walked into that situation with, which was, thinking that anyone would necessarily expect justice as a matter of course.
Yeah, and a position of privilege, I guess, ultimately. So it's almost like it's about access, like who feels they even. Yeah. And maybe we're all different degrees away from it, Yeah. That's a really thought-provoking, and I think it's a great addition to the answers I'm getting. So thanks for your insight on that. And thanks for talking about your work on Mobland, which everyone should listen to. We'll put links in the show notes. And thank you so much, Jake, for killing the small talk.
Thanks for having me.
Dialogue is a Yellow Tape Media production, audio engineered by Jason Usry and produced, hosted, and edited by me, Rebecca Sebastian. If you love the podcast, please consider becoming a diehard by signing up at patreon.com/dialogue. Other ways to support the show? Follow along on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across platforms, and you can now watch most episodes on YouTube by subscribing to my channel, Rebecca Sebastian. For more information or to drop me a note, visit RebeccaSebastian.com. Until next time, thank you for listening and killing the small talk. Javier, I can't believe it. Everything that needed to be said about cults has been said. I feel so empty inside.
Wait a minute, Rebecca. I'm not sure that's true. Have you ever thought about how cults kind of operate like businesses?
Yeah, I mean, like businesses, cults operate like a startup, then mature into larger organizations and sometimes become institutions, or they go under.
What if we explored the business of cults and what happens once the leader dies or leaves?
You mean leaves for prison?
Yeah, and in some cases, even worse.
I like it. Go on.
We can expose the leaders as the con artists they are, which, it's kind of my thing.
Yes, and we can interview experts on cults to help us understand this analogy, which you know is kind of my thing.
Exactly. And it allows us to keep investigating cults, which is totally
our thing.
Join me, Javier Leyva, from the Pretend Podcast.
And me, Rebecca Sebastian, from Dialogue Podcast. The Business of Cults drops the week of February 7th on both the Pretend Podcast and Dialogue feeds. I'm so happy the cult conversation isn't over.